When invited to give a lecture here tonight, I was asked to give a lecture. The title was chosen by those who invited me, How to Be a Muslim in America. My comments, therefore, are based upon the thesis that there is a will to be a Muslim in America. Those who do not want to be a Muslim in America, what I have to say does not address them. The question is, if one wants to be a Muslim in America, how to be so? For the sake of clarification, I have chosen the metaphor of space for my talk tonight. Space, not only in its physical sense of the Cartesian coordinates of x, y, z, the geometric space that we experience during daily life, but space in its symbolic sense. In order for a human being to function, he or she needs a space. In American English, it's common to say, I need my own space. That means a psychological, mental, spiritual, as well as physical world within which one can function. And this is especially true of religion. Not only to be a Muslim, but to follow any other religion requires a particular religious space. Now, to be a Muslim in particular brings about many, many challenges because we do not live at the present moment in an already created space into which we might be born and live had we lived in any part of Dar al-Islam as our ancestors did. It is very much like the first generation of Muslims who went to China in Canton in the first century of the Hijrah, or to Sindh in the second century of the Hijrah, and so forth and so on. There are many other examples. And so the question is how to create this space. I believe that there are 5 kinds of spaces of which we are in need, and each of which must be discussed separately. First of all, there is what I would call the spiritual and inner space. A human being needs an inner space, and space within himself or herself with which to function. And especially a Muslim needs that inner spiritual space. Then there is what I would call the ritual space. There is need for space within which to perform one's rituals, which does not only mean the carpet of 1.5 yards or 1 yard on which one prays, but also other ways of being able to move about, including the Hajj and Psalm and other practices of Islam, the ritual aspects which require space to make it feasible and possible. Thirdly, there's the need of what one could call a legal and social space, which would embrace in the Islamic sense the Sharia, which is extremely difficult to apply and to live by in a world which is not in fact an Islamic world. And then fourthly, there is what one could call the intellectual space. We are thinking beings, and surely we arrive at the goal through which we think and about which we think. It is thought that really conducts us in life toward wherever we want to go. Therefore, the intellectual space is extremely significant. And finally, there is the aesthetic space, because we are also creatures who make things. And the aesthetic space, in the vastest sense of the term, which embraces all forms of art and all the different forms with which we surround ourselves, from what is closest to our body and soul, our clothing, to the space of our house, to the larger spaces within which we move. Now, in order to live as a Muslim in America would ideally require the Islamization of all these 5 spaces, but one which is very difficult at the present moment, because they are not automatically done for us. We must start with ourselves. We are faced with certain challenges which are very different from the challenges of a young man or woman living in Cairo or Tehran or Karachi or somewhere else and being brought up. And even different from being a minority in a country like India or China, where Muslims have lived for 1,000 years and where the status of minority has nevertheless created a space within which they live. So what do we do now that we live in America? Really, the first generation of Muslims who join now the mainstream of American religion. which is itself a remarkable fact. Just before your eyes during the last 10, 15 years, Islam, in a sense, has become from being a quaint, exotic, or feared, marginal religion to a mainstream religion. And very rapidly, this is going to become a recognized fact, even in the small towns of Iowa and Mississippi, not to talk about the big cities of the two sides of the continent, the eastern and the western coasts. So let's turn now to the first of these spaces, the spiritual and inner space. Without that, of course, there's no possibility of living as a Muslim. To be a Muslim, we must first of all transform our inner space. It's this inner space which involves, first of all, faith, al-Iman. That is, that invisible link between us and God. Ittisafi bi takayyuf bi qiyas hast Rabbun Nas ra ba jan nas, as Jalaluddin Rumi says. That is a relation without comparison and without analogy, relates every soul to the Lord of that soul, to God. That inner relationship has to do with that inner space. But if that were not there, the other four spaces would be irrelevant. A person in whom that relation has not become manifest, that is, the inner space is not filled with the love for Allah Ta'ala and His Prophet, with the instructions of the Noble Quran, this address would not be for him or her anyway. So the first important step is to Islamize the inner space. And that, in a sense, although the most essential, is also the easiest. Because external circumstances do not have a way of totally controlling our inner space. You could be riding on a train to a suburb of New York amidst all the noise and inwardly be with God. You could also travel on a camel in the middle of the desert and forget God. Our inner space possesses a certain independence from external circumstances, which is precisely why God holds us responsible for our actions wherever we are. That's the secret and mystery why, whether we are living in a holy city like Qom or in an unholy city where you can do anything promiscuous by just walking the street, we are nevertheless held responsible. That responsibility comes from the possibility of living in this inner space, independent of whatever the outward contingencies are. Unfortunately, from this point of view, living in America affords very positive possibilities. That is, the freedom which exists in this society, much of which is negative, I shall turn to this very soon, nevertheless makes it very easy for the person who has the desire, who has the propensity to make the inner space an Islamic space. One doesn't have to be rich, one doesn't have to have a big garden, one doesn't have to buy expensive Persian carpets to pray on, one doesn't have to have a great deal of time to read difficult books. It involves the essential reassertion of our eternal link with the Divine who has created us upon the fitra, that is, upon the primordial creation which we bear within ourselves and which Islam insists upon. And that also is abetted by the fact that in Islam we are all our own priests. There is no separate priesthood in Islam. All men and women are priests, if you can use such a term taken from other religions, because the word does not exist in the Islamic context in the same manner, by virtue of this direct role which we play as priests towards our own soul, towards our own inner being. The spiritual space, of course, also involves all our inner spiritual development, our quest for the sacred, our flight towards the One, the expansion of the wings of the soul, and all that in the context of traditional Islam has been included as Islamic spirituality, manifesting itself in Sufism, in certain aspects of Shiism, in certain aspects even of external laws of Islam, but always related to the purely spiritual message, which in the Islamic tradition is connected with the inner nature of the Prophet, alayhi salatu wassalam, and also especially with the transmission of that to Hazrat Ali alayhi salam, who is sort of the father of the inner path for both Sunnis and Shiites in the Islamic world. After that space, we need a ritual space. To be a Muslim in America requires the creation of a ritual space. That doesn't mean only having a corner of a room which is clean and you can say our prayers in. It does mean that. That's quite important, very, very significant. But it means to live in such a way that the spaces around which we move during the day include the possibility of being able to pray. And living in such a way as to be able to fast if one is not sick during Ramadan. These are two fundamental rights, because the right of the Hajj is once a lifetime, and that can always come when one is prepared. But the most important of these ritual acts is, of course, the daily prayers. And in addition to that, all that has to do with the chanting of the Quran and the prayers which have been traditionally transmitted from the Prophet, the great saints, in the case of Shiism, from the Imams, such as the Sahifat al-Sajadiyya and other works of this kind. These prayers, complementing the Quran, themselves are, of course, a form of ritual. And the great challenge begins here. That is how living in a society in which the spaces are not always provided, the ablution is not always easy to make, time is devoured in a very demonic way. I always say jokingly that anything you save in the world, it usually increases. If you save money, your saving account increases. But the modern world is based always on time-saving devices. But where's all the time that we have saved? There's no time. That's the demonic nature of the world in which we live. With all these time-saving devices, where is the time you've saved? There's not the time. And so it takes a great jihad to be able to create these islands in the middle of the day to be able to pray. And this is one of the great challenges that Islam also faced in other societies when it went there. But the big difference that those societies also had a rhythm of life based upon the primacy of the sacred, of prayer, of ritual. I mean, if, let's say, Muslims lived in Hindu India, all the Brahmins would get up and pray and sing the Bhagavad Gita for 2 hours from 6 to 8 in the morning, and during those 2 hours the Muslims would go and say their prayers. It was not like this society in which what remains the Western religion is pushed into a couple of hours of Sunday morning, and that is difficult to get some people to go, and the religion is marginalized. So normal times are not set for ritual. One of the great geniuses, you might say, elements of genius of Islamic civilization, was to create a rhythm of life during the day which was always based upon the prayers. Now, everything else was around that. Now, we have no power to be able to create that rhythm in the world in which we live, in America. But as God had foreseen what would happen in this time of history in which we have lived, He's made the rituals of Islam remarkably easy to perform, including the fact that the Prophet sometimes performed his prayers on horseback without even getting down from the horse in the middle of war, which could be interpreted to mean that if one is really in the middle of a war of some kind, it doesn't have to be war with sword, but with one's boss or some job or something like that, to even say it inwardly. That's I don't see what that cannot be done, because the Prophet practiced that at certain times. Anyway, there's this great jihad of being able to create this ritual space. Now, this also, to some extent, the Islamic community is moving towards achieving. I'm not saying has achieved it completely. The fact that all American cities now have mosques in some places, and that there are many places, for example, in the U.S. Army, in prisons, including now the Senate and Congress, and places like that where there are prayer rooms. There are now places which are being set for also Islamic prayers. And I'm sure very soon, if the Islamic community puts the right pressure in the right places, in airports, I'm sure, as they have in Europe in some places, there'll be not only a chapel for Christians to pray in, but also a little place where you can put a prayer mat and say your prayers. But this remains, especially for young people, a difficult task, because each human being has to create a rhythm in his or her own life to be able to create this ritual space. Society does not do it for them. And so the responsibility remains upon our shoulders. I know that there are many Muslims who don't pray anymore. Many of them have excuses of all kinds in order not to do so. That's between them and God. According to any authentic understanding of Islam, it is the attestation to Islam that makes a person a Muslim. Its degree of practice and the inner intention is between that person and God. And one hopes and prays that inshallah they will begin to say their prayers because of the significance of the daily prayers, which make us stand face to face before God 5 times a day, which break this monotony of the forgetfulness of God, which we call everyday life. What we call everyday life is a stream of the forgetfulness of God. And it breaks that categorically in order to put us face to face with reality, which we're going to face at the moment of death anyway, when we're pulled out of this stream of time with which we associate reality. Now, as I said, will remain in the years to come a major challenge until Islam is well enough known in Islamic society that a person working in a factory, in an airport, in a shop, and so forth and so on will be afforded the times, a few moments in the afternoon and evening, or if he's working at night, to be able to say his prayers or her prayers. But the creation of a ritual space is the mark of the establishment of Islam, at least in its ritual aspect, in this new world, which is America. The third space is much more difficult, the creation of a legal and social space. Islam is a religion which is not only based upon purely spiritual injunctions, but upon a divine law. The Sharia, from the point of Islam, is the embodiment of God's concrete will. And in this, we are much closer to the Jews than to the Christians. Christianity does not have a Sharia in the same way, but Judaism does. It has the halakha. And that helps the Muslims. For example, there are Jews who do not eat kosher food. In the 19th century, people mocked them. What is this? What's the difference between drinking milk and eating meat like this? And it was incomprehensible. But they persisted and persisted. And now, thanks to them, oftentimes in a conference, you can get kosher food. The Muslim halal food still has not entered into the mainstream. But to try to at least have some elements of the Sharia promulgated is a very, very difficult task. There's no hope for Islam as a minority in this country to be able to implement the Sharia fully. It's difficult enough in the Islamic world itself through all the changes that were brought in the 19th century by the introduction of European law, the Belgian Code, the Napoleonic Code, the Tanzimat, changes in law in Egypt and in Persia, introduction of British law into the Indian subcontinent and into Nigeria and so forth and so on. I will not burden you. Much of the battle that's going on in the Islamic world today is on the question of the re-implementation of the Sharia. All of you know that. And even in countries which have wanted to re-implement it, like in Iran, there's still a great deal of problem. You have banks which still charge interest, you'd have to do this, you do that. But the ideal anyway for all of these countries in one way or another is to be able to go back to Shari'ite law. Now, if that's difficult in that part of the world, it's surely much more difficult here. And here the whole question comes of the more social and external aspect of the Sharia. It's economic laws, for example. How to live in a society which is based completely upon interest and usury without participating in it. What are the decisions to be made? Or anywhere that you work, you pay taxes. And the taxes are collected by government. That government may do something which is not your liking as far as the Islamic world is concerned. If the next time they drop bombs, then they kill another 250,000 Iraqis, 250,000 soldiers. Is our share in the taxation helping that or not? These are very, very difficult issues, very difficult issues. And I'm not going to get into that tonight. This is a story for a long, long time. And on the one hand, the Sharia always tells us that wherever we live, if it's a society which is not Islamic, to follow the qanun, that is the law, the regular so-called secular law of the society is itself part of the Sharia. That's a very, very important edict that has been given by many of the great ulama. That is, if you're living in Madagascar, and in Madagascar you cannot cross the street except at 9 a.m., and that's nothing to do with the Sharia, to follow the law of the land is itself incumbent upon you as a Muslim, unless it goes against the Sharia. It's a very important principle that will have to be developed later on by jurists who are Muslims and of this country or of Europe, which has very similar problems. But some of these are extremely complicated. So what do we do? The Sharia is composed of two parts, the ibadat and the muamalat. The ibadat, which have to do with worship. Those are acts for which we have no excuse before God. The muamalat, which have to do with transactions. Surely God does not ask of us what we cannot do. There are things which are beyond our control. We cannot say we will not cross the bridge here to San Francisco and back because we do not know what they use the toll for. It might be for an Islamic end. Some people have gone to those extremes and have paralyzed themselves and the Islamic community. I believe that Islam has put very, very practical means of being able to live in a society in which the Sharia does not exist, but at least have surrounding of the Sharia as far as our personal life is concerned to the extent possible. For example, I'll give you another example. Any devout Muslim does not eat pork. That's very easy not to eat. And now, again, thanks to some extent to Judaism, which also doesn't eat pork, almost always there are choices. But even if there aren't, we won't die of hunger if we don't have lunch. And then there are pork derivatives added to all kinds of things like string beans, where one didn't think at first whether string beans has to do with pork, but if you read, there's a very little line that says the pork fat added, so you don't buy that either. But then there are other places where there's nothing is announced, and we get to a point where one doesn't know what to do. There again, I think excessive, you might say, sensitivity to these makes it very difficult to practice the religion as God expects us to practice it. I believe that the United States affords us the possibility of at least practicing the Sharia in our immediate life and leaving the rest in the hands of God. It's very, very important as Muslims not to forget tawakkul, which we do all the time. We cannot solve all the problems of the world. God does not expect of us any more than we are. He knows our weaknesses much better than we know. But He does expect of us what we can do. That's the other half of it. And so it's very important to strike a correct balance in this. As far as the social space is concerned, without doubt, Islam will create a social space for itself, as again, Catholicism did when it came in the 19th century, and at first it was detested by the Protestants. First Italians who came here were as much hated as some Muslims were hated in the 60s and 70s and still are, and other groups, Jews in the 30s and all of these other groups. But all these other religious communities gradually created for themselves a kind of society within society. I've said this and I've been criticized very severely by some secularized compatriots of mine in Los Angeles, that very strange city where all kinds of things are said because there's so many people of different views. I've said that in the United States, no community has survived without a religious center. You have no exceptions. The Greeks, when they first came to America, the first thing that they established was the Greek Orthodox Church and a school, and then now they have all these Greek restaurants and Greek this and Greek that. At first it was around the religion. The Swedes, the Lutherans, when they came in the 17th century, were the same way, 18th century. The Germans, the same way. Italian Catholics, the same way. Irish Catholic, the same way. Puerto Ricans, the same way. The Jews, the same way. We cannot be the only exception. It's not going to work out. It is possible to create a sense of community, but it has to be based not on ethnicity, but on Islam. There's no chance for the various ethnic groups from the Islamic world to come to this country and survive qua-ethnic groups without a religious identity. I don't believe that's a possibility. The history of 300 years of the white man's living in this continent, since 350 years, since the Plymouth Landing of 1636, has shown it. But if one begins with a religious center, a religious basis, one can gradually create a social structure around it. And here, of course, the most precious and dear unit is the family. How blessed are those whose family structures survive, especially for the immigrants. For the first generation, it's extremely difficult because all of the ideals of the Islamic family are negated in the world in which we live in America. Take just the word teenager. Why is this word so important? It doesn't exist in Arabic. It doesn't exist in Persian. It doesn't exist in Turkish. It doesn't exist in Urdu. Why are the youth always a problem? When I was a child being brought up in Tehran, to be young was not a problem. It was part of life. The idea that you have to rebel, the idea that you must show disrespect towards your mother and father in order to do your thing, this idea of the atomization of the family, that first of all the cousins and aunts drop out, and then the grandfather and grandmother drop out, and now the single unit is breaking up. Father and mother are too many. One mother is enough. Half the children in this country are brought up in single family homes, and these great tragedies, this whole breakup of the social structure, which did not exist a generation ago in the United States, is going on right before our eyes. And the funny thing is that the people who are its propagators are trying to teach the rest of the world how to do this, which is really asinine, absolutely absurd. When I talk about this to some American friends, they say, why doesn't the rest of the world follow us? I said, look, you're carrying out a laboratory experimentation in social engineering. Let's wait and see what comes out of it. And now that you're arresting boys of 6 for sexual harassment for kissing girls of 5, and boys of 9 are shooting boys of 6, we don't want to emulate you. Let's wait and see. But for our children, our families who are in this country, of course, this poses a tremendous challenge. And I believe that there's no way for the family structure to be saved without iman, without faith. All of the Persian families, I talk about my own compatriots, I'll say nothing about the Arabs and Pakistanis and others. The Persians, I'm an Iranian myself. I always use the word Persian in English because Iranian doesn't mean anything in English. But anyway, whatever you use. All of the Persians who've tried it, something becomes unglued because the younger generation begins to emulate the society around itself. And the idea of rebellion becomes one of the factors for the building of character. This is inculcated in American education, that to rebel, to do your own thing, makes you be a strong character. This is not necessarily so. Civilizations have survived for millennia without this being necessarily a condition. And for us who want to live as a Muslim in America, there's no way of creating a social space without, in fact, the family. And we must try to keep the family in its traditional Islamic sense, that is extended family, to try the utmost possible to keep relations with brothers and sisters and aunts and cousins, despite all the difficulties, despite the fact it's a jihad against the current of things, because it will take a little bit more time to create a larger community beyond the family. And that is also opposed by this very strong wind that blows through American society of economic motive. That oftentimes you live 10 years in a city, then you get a job which gives you $2,000 more a year, and your company transplants you 2,000 miles away. It's extremely difficult to have permanent relationships. It needs economic sacrifice. And it has been done by other communities. For 2 centuries, the Chinatown of Boston and San Francisco, which were the oldest Chinatowns in this country, soon followed by New York, the Chinese clung together, didn't get out of Chinatown. It isn't that they were that poor. They could have gone other places, but they sacrificed a lot of economic advance in order to cling together as a Chinese community. And also, when the Jews again first came to America, they wouldn't go out of New York City. For a long, long time, there were no Jews anywhere else, until they become a strong enough community to not be afraid to go to Miami and Los Angeles and other places where they have very big presence at the present moment. It needs quite a bit of sacrifice. And it's strange, with all these Muslims whom we have in major cities, like Los Angeles, New York, Washington, I'm sure here, I don't know how many Muslims there are in the San Francisco area, but I'm sure tens of thousands, we have not been able to create a sense of community yet. There are many, many reasons for that. One is that ethnicity has become interwoven with Islam in the minds of those who have migrated to this country, and that's very natural. You're losing your Islam, that sort of thing, or Persian might think the same way, and an Arab the same way, and others the same way. And the American Muslims, whether black or white, they have a lot to teach these other people who are immigrants from this point of view, and these groups must gradually become integrated together. But this has not taken place. It's only in the last, including with the Sunni Shiite division, and within Sunnism between various schools of law, and then there are other side groups like the Ismailis and so forth and so on, what to do with all of these. And on this point, I'm very far from being pessimistic. They're very rapidly, gradually, these walls are being lifted, and I think within the next decade, gradually you will be able to get a kind of community, an Islamic community, not just people coming and pray together, but bonds and links outside of the mosque or the madrasa or the school. Now let me turn to the last two and the most difficult of these spaces. The fourth space that I mentioned is the intellectual space. It is impossible for a religion to survive without having sacralized the intellectual space of its followers. That's obvious if a person has studied the history of religions. Thought is not neutral. There is no thought that is neutral. Every thought has an effect upon the soul. Islam created a major intellectual tradition, one of the great intellectual traditions of the world, in philosophy, in theology, in the sciences, in logic, in literary criticism, in grammar, you name it. It's one of the richest. And for the last 1300 years, that is 1 century after the rise of Islam, when these intellectual schools were formulated in Basra, Kufa, Khurasan, other places, until now, the intellectual space of the Islamic world was always filled with forms of knowledge which ultimately led to God. Even if they happened to be quadratic equations solved by Umar Khayyam in algebra, could be from pure mathematics to theology and everything in between. There was no secularized knowledge. Islam did not accept the category of secularized knowledge. While producing some of the greatest science, astronomy, physics, everything else, everything functioned within a sacral universe. Now, the West divorced knowledge from the sacred at the time of the Renaissance and created the first civilization in the world in which knowledge goes its own way without necessarily referring to theology or religion. And Western theology began to retreat. Rather than combating, it began to retreat. It first of all gave up the cosmos. By the time the Galileo trial was over in the 17th century, the Catholic Church gave up any Christian knowledge of the universe. Whereas we read in the very first verse that was chanted so beautifully this evening, all things in heaven and earth praise God. You cannot have a science of heaven and earth, that is the world, which is totally impervious to this reality. And then gradually Protestantism showed total indifference to the world of nature. Then in the 19th century, the science of the soul, the psyche, was secularized. With Sigmund Freud, an arch-atheist who detested religion, who detested God, who also comes from a Jewish background. He hated Moses and wrote unbelievable things against his own prophet. This domain also was taken out of the hands of religion. Now many people are trying to go back to it. And other domains one after another. And so a young Muslim, when it comes to the university, especially higher education, but even in elementary school and secondary school, is faced with what appears to be neutral knowledge, which is not neutral at all. It is faced with an intellectual space which might not talk about either for Islam or against Islam, for Christianity or against Christianity, but by making God a redundant hypothesis, creates a space which cannot be accepted by Islam. This is perhaps the greatest challenge for Muslims, to be able to integrate modern knowledge into an Islamic worldview. That's a very, very tall order, very difficult order. But today in this country, although many Christians are also fighting for it, there is a secularized pseudo-religion, which in the name of opposition to religion, inculcates people with irreligiosity. I'll just give you one example of it. The theory of evolution is not a scientific fact, it's a biological ideology. It's the last materialistic ideology of the 19th century that has not fallen down. Now that Marxism is gone, Freudianism is gone, and the physics, Newtonian physics, has been changed. This is the last materialistic ideology of the 19th century. That is, it posits that everything in the world, including us, is the result of changes of material forces from the original soup of molecules at the beginning of the history of the world. Anything else that is added to evolution is, as we would call in Persian, sher. It's poetry in the negative sense. It's just sentiment, it's nonsense. Theistic evolution and so forth has nothing to do with evolution, that's just well-wishing. This is the logical scientific gist of this. Now this is unproven, of course it's unproven, you cannot prove it. But why is it people fight for it with such religiosity? Because this is the prop of the modern world. Once this is pulled out, the whole tent will fall down. And children are not given a choice. They're taught, in fact, a religion in the name of science. No physicist, no mathematician would take you by the tie or by the shirt if you oppose some theory in quantum mechanics or have a new formula in mathematics. But if you're a biologist and you say that, you usually get kicked out of university, things are written against you, you're considered to be a quack, and so forth and so on. And so we live in an educational system in which it is very difficult to create an intellectual space which is properly Islamic. Now, Islam is not going to survive in this country for long if it is not able to create its own intellectual space. Islam was able to do that in the other major cases where it was a minority, especially in China and in India. That is, in two civilizations which had a highly developed philosophical, scientific tradition, which were not simply illiterate people roaming around. They were extremely literate, extremely learned, and Islam brought with it actually an intellectual tradition which challenged, acted and reacted vis-a-vis both Hinduism and Confucianism, and created many great works of thought which we all know about. Now, this is a challenge which has to be carried out. Fortunately, during the last 30 years, a great deal of the Islamic intellectual tradition has now been reformulated in the English language. You do not have to be a great master of Arabic and Persian. Not enough has been done, but something has been done. And the young people sitting in this room today are in a much better position than when I was their age, 35 years ago. But still a great deal more needs to be done, and it's useless to talk about how to live as a Muslim in America without asking the question how to create an intellectual space, which means having to provide, for example, for books for our young from an early age until they go to college, presenting sacred history, the life of the Prophet, ethics, the relation between God and the universe, and then when you grow older, the philosophies and theologies which have grown out of Islam, so that they will be able to have a sense of belonging without feeling an inferiority complex. As long as the young feel an inferiority complex, they will abandon what they have. There's no doubt about it. And having abandoned their intellectual view of the universe, gradually their faith is weakened, because it becomes really a kind of luxury which doesn't fit into the whole world view. There is both a great advantage and a great disadvantage at the present moment for those who want to live as a Muslim in America. The disadvantage is that even religion in America, both Christianity and Judaism, which had been strong, are now becoming weakened very rapidly. The advantage is that the secularist worldview, with the help of which religion was weakened for the last 4 centuries, itself dying very rapidly. It's falling apart from within. And that's why you have this plethora of views, of search for spirituality, of religion, including pseudo-religion, to which I shall come in a moment, for which the main home is the west coast of the United States, between here and Los Angeles. The air is somehow special, and all kinds of things grow in this area, which you know better than myself. But at the same time affords a situation in which there's less pressure than, let's say, there was in 1896, 100 years ago. If you were studying in 1896 in Paris or in Berlin or London, which were then the great centers of learning, or in this country, California wasn't discovered yet, there were Indians roaming around, not quite, but anyway. You didn't have great universities here, but at Harvard and Yale and other places. The certitude that the Western post-Renaissance view of the world had of itself, and its success in the conquest of the world, was so strong, it was very difficult to oppose it. Today, it's not very difficult. You can take any American poet or English poet and see what they've written about what the world is like. And anything you find in Western philosophy, somebody will write its opposite. And so, in a sense, the pressure cooker has released some of its pressure. But nevertheless, the task of creating an intellectual ambience remains a very, very great challenge. And this is not going to be identical with the Islamic intellectual ambience of Istanbul or Tehran or Cairo, because it has to take into consideration the fact that, in fact, that these groups of people, the Muslims, are living in American society, and they're not living in a totally Islamic society. It also provides a great positive advantage, and that is that there are many important debates in the Islamic world which cannot be carried out because of political reasons. And the Islamic community in this country can carry out certain intellectual enterprises which will have the deepest repercussions back in the Islamic world if done correctly. In the Islamic world, usually, I've said jokingly, you always have two types of governments: those which are Islamic and those which are anti-Islamic. The Islamic ones have their own interpretation of Islam. So if you say something other than that, you get into trouble. I mean, in Saudi Arabia, if you begin to praise Ghazali too much rather than Ibn Taymiyyah, you've had it. You have to resign from university, something will happen to you. And then on those governments which are anti-Islamic, they don't want you to discuss Islam anyway. Like in Tunisia or someplace like that, what do you do if you're in the University of Tunis? So you have a very peculiar situation that's never occurred in the history of Islam before, that the Muslims in exile play a very important intellectual role in being able to openly discuss major issues, which then if they come to some authentic conclusion, not just some pseudo-conclusion, will have the deepest effect upon the Islamic world. I always say that the test of authenticity is that if some Muslim thinker in the West says something, not only to please an American audience, but to tell the truth, is that if he goes in the middle of the bazaar of Isfahan and says the same thing, people will not throw a tomato at him or a stone at him. Most of us who do this, in fact, say nonsense because those are way out on the limb. A lot of things are said by Islamic scholars in America, especially those who are invited all the time here and there. They're invited to hear things which the audience wants to hear, not what the Islamic people believe in. That's why you have so many outrageous interpretations, which are also coming out. But let them come out, it doesn't matter. The important thing is that the possibility of this intellectual activity is present. And now I come to the last, the aesthetic. Many of us belittle the significance of the aesthetic element. We forget that the Prophet said, alayhi salatu wassalam, Allahu jamilun yuhibbu jamal, that is, God is beautiful and He loves beauty. And the name Al-Jamil is one of the names of God, the beautiful. Nowhere has Islam gone without creating an ambience of beauty. It is very significant that evil and ugliness are the same word in Arabic, qubh, and beauty and goodness are the same word, husn. So ugliness is also evil. This indifference that many both modernized Muslims and puritanical Muslims have to beauty is a sign of our own spiritual decadence. It's nothing less than that. Because look at the history of Islamic civilization. All the way from the Alhambra in Granada to the Taj Mahal in India. And much farther east, I don't want to mention them because you don't perhaps know all of the famous mosques of Sumatra and other places. But anyway, wherever Islam has gone, has created an ambience of beauty. And that's not only in the mosque. Start with the most important art, the art of the dress. The Islamic dress was always beautiful, both the male and female dress. At the same time, it was closely allied to the Islamic ritual, to both the ablutions and the prayers. I always say jokingly that you really have to be one of the saints of God to wear a Western dress and make your ablutions all the time and pray without your wife fighting against you every night because you wrinkled your pants and she has to press them and then next morning you do it again. This dress that I'm wearing is not made for the Islamic prayers, obviously. And whether we're going to have the genius of developing an Islamic dress in America, I do not know. Of course, in this country, it's not so easy. You can wear anything in the street and that nobody says anything. The Western form of dress is broken down. But all the way from the art of the dress to the art of the decoration of the house, which is the next close thing to us, to the art then of the city, urban design and architecture, were imbued with beauty. Now, we in America are not as yet in a position to create a whole city. They've tried that in England twice. And in America, Dar es-Salaam was built in Abiquiu in New Mexico by the great Egyptian architect Hassan Fatih, a magnificent site. But it's not worked very well because on top of a mesa in New Mexico and there's just a few families living there. For the long time to come, we will not be able to create an Isfahan in America. We should be practical. So what do? We again have to start from where we are. I think the creation of an aesthetic ambience is both possible and extremely significant in the preservation of the reality of Islam for those living in America. Let's start first of all with music. It's not sufficient to say music is haram. First of all, music is not haram. Only certain kinds of music is haram, as many of the ulama have said. And Ayatollah Khomeini himself gave that famous fatwa. Music which incites the passions towards evil is haram. But whether haram or halal, we're living in a society in which there's music everywhere. Now, most of this music comes from the lower psyche, the very, very lower levels of the psyche, which incites the animal passions. It's not that difficult with all the new gadgets and electronic means that are available today to make accessible the classical music of the Islamic people to the young, especially the very young. Because the classical music of the Islamic people, whether it's Persian classical music, Arabic classical music, Turkish music, which comes from Mawlavi order, North Indian music, is very deeply imbued with a sense of the love of God. It's absolutely impossible to enjoy classical Persian music and be an atheist. That's a psychological impossibility. At least at the moment of hearing this music. Either you're putting on an act, you're not enjoying it, or if you are enjoying it, there's something that draws one to God. Whereas you can listen to a Beethoven symphony. I have great respect for Western music. I listen to a great deal of it, and it has many beautiful things in it. Even poor Johann Sebastian Bach, who only wrote religious music. There are many people who are atheists and listen to the Mass of Bach. When the B minor Mass is performed, 4,000 people come to the church. When the Mass itself is on Sunday morning, 120 people come. I mean, this in Washington, it's like that. I don't know what's like in San Francisco. Because you can, in a sense, have an intellectual appreciation. Whereas with the classical music of Islamic people, there's a love of God that is within that music. And all of the singing and chanting is always a nostalgia for the divine. It's always really Sufi poetry, which talks about the beloved, her beautiful face and so forth, but which really means the love of God. And even the word Habibi or Layla and things like that in Arabic music, or just the word Habib, that's the name of the Prophet, Habibullah. And Habibi is not only the person I'm going to get married to next month, but she herself symbolizes the divine love. So it's possible to create acoustic ambience of an aesthetic nature, which is not so difficult, but about which most Muslim parents are very, very lackadaisical, because they don't think it's important. And then we come to the visual ambience. It's extremely significant to make the Muslim home look Islamic. This is not something trivial. It is not to say that religion has to do with the soul, this is just the body and it's external. We are not dismembered souls, we're joined to our body. And especially in Islam, the same with the tahara of the body is so important. What does God care? Somebody would say whether we wash our body or not. He wants our soul. That's not true. Our body, in a sense, is an extension of our soul. That's why when you make the wudu, your soul also feels lighter. It's very different from just dunking yourself into a pool of water. In the same way, the visual aspect of that which surrounds us, whether it be the carpet, what we put on the wall, the kind of furniture that we have, if it reflects Islamic art, it will always be a reminder of the realities of the Islamic revelation. It is impossible to walk in a traditional Islamic city and not be reminded of God. It's not only because of the adhan that comes every few hours. The architecture, the calligraphy, the tile work, the spaces, the interrelationship of the spaces, it goes all the way to the esoteric relations of architectural space in a place like the Isfahan Mosque and Bazaar, which is one of the great works of human art, where this is present. And if we cannot do it on a macro scale, it can at least be done on a micro scale. All the mosques that Muslims are building in this country should be based upon an Islamic model, not the passions and individualism of an individual who happens to be named Ahmad rather than John. That doesn't make Islamic architecture. Islamic architecture is not creating a box and putting a minaret on top of it. That's not Islamic architecture. There's no excuse under the sun why we're spending millions and millions of dollars creating these ugly mosques across the United States. That's really a very great tragedy. We have to go back to the Islamic architectural traditions, try to apply it to the American ambience. In the same way when Islam went to India, it took Persian Islamic architecture and it went to India. And so that's why the Badishahi Mosque of Lahore looks like a Persian mosque and it doesn't look like a Persian mosque, because it took that element and applied it to the new ambience of the Indian subcontinent. Or the beautiful mosque of Mali in Africa, one of the greatest masterpieces of art that we never hear about. It took the principle of the Medina Mosque, applied it to the climate of Mali and Timbuktu, which was very different from Lahore. And this is what we have to do, but until that comes, at least let us pay attention to the immediate ambience which surrounds the soul, which affects us all the time. I think if we can create these 5 ambiences in the way they have outlined them, we'll be able certainly to live very successfully as Muslims in America. But if we do so, there are four major challenges which I believe we will face, and we face now, Muslims face now, which I want to mention briefly and come to a conclusion in case you want to ask some questions. First of all, in America, even more than Europe, Muslims, as well as everybody else, lives in a society with a tremendous amount of freedom, but the freedom which is almost always in the downward direction. It is possible in this freedom to also move upward, but all the temptations and tendencies are in the downward direction. And almost all of this freedom is against the teachings of Islam and the Prophet. For example, to be content with what we have. قناعت توانگر کند مرد را, Seyyed said. To be content with what we have is what will make a man rich. This is blasphemy in the modern religion of capitalistic economics. If everybody were to be satisfied with what he or she had, what would they do with all the junk that they sell to us in consumer society? The idea of creating need all the time, artificial need, and which already is taken to its absurdity. We don't do any exercise because even a toothbrush is not electrical, so you don't have to move your hand, and it does it for you. Then we pay money to go to the spa, and we go 1, 2, 3, 4, because we're not doing any exercise. Cutting off the normal functions of life from life, and then introducing an artificial means of compensating for it. So we have a lot of freedoms, but most of this freedom is like going down. We get exhilarated like a roller coaster going down, but actually it means the fall of the soul. It is always easier to fall than to go up. Like in these streets of San Francisco, when you go downhill, it's easy, but once you want to go up, it takes all of your energy. The great challenge is what to do in a society in which there is so much freedom. This was not the challenge in the old days. If, let's say, again, give this example, Islam migrated to China. The Muslims in Turkestan al-Sharqi, Eastern Turkestan, which is now called Xinjiang by the Chinese, they did not have the freedom to go out in mini skirts into this Uyghur country, into Kashgar, or write outlandish poems against the Prophet of Islam or against Confucius or anybody else, but certain things they could not do. Now, a lot of things that we can do. And this excess of freedom without control, of the idea of rights without responsibility, poses a tremendous challenge to all people of religion, especially Muslims, because in Islam, all of our rights come from a responsibility towards God. There are no innate human rights because we did not create ourselves. We cannot create a fly. We do not create ourselves. Our rights come from our responsibility towards God. There is حقوق الناس, حقوق Allah. That is the rights of God and the rights of man in classical Islamic texts. And the rights of man are based upon the rights of God. So what do we do in a society in which the rights of God are zero, are meaningless, and the rights of man are extended to unbelievable, you might say, exaggerations, which are not threatening human existence itself, as you see in all these absurdities which society presents itself. The second is, which is close related to this, is living in a society dominated by materialistic ethos, that is, of consuming, and consuming all the time. Because you cannot be a good Muslim, putting aside the question of economic justice, of serving the poor, of helping others, but simply living in luxury. Islam is always based upon simplicity. It hates excessive luxury. Not that there has not been excessive luxury in the Islamic world, of course there has been, but that's human weakness. So the teachings of Islam have always discouraged excessive luxury. The saying of the Prophet, al-faqru fakhri, that is, poverty is my honor, did not mean only economic poverty, but I mean spiritual poverty. Like Christ said, blessed are the poor in spirit. But at the same time, it meant that the Prophet always remained on the side of simplicity. And in Shiism, Ali, for example, was known for the simple way in which he lived, for the shunning of luxury. It's very difficult to be devout and always be in luxury. It's possible, it's not impossible, but it's difficult. In the old days, you had a few very saintly and pious men who were also very rich. And there's a hadith, whether it's mutawatir or not, it's been debated, that wealth is like a ladder. You can either climb up the ladder to heaven, or you could descend down the ladder into hell. But it wasn't that the whole of society encouraged that. So this is one of the great challenges that living in America poses. The third, which is a very painful challenge, is to live in a state that is a superpower, that is oftentimes does things in the rest of the world, and especially the Islamic world, which all Muslims believe is against the interest of Islam. And the fact that the Muslims are not well organized and that they have no political pressure, that 50 of our cousins, the Jews, count more than 5 million Muslims in any issue, is of course a disgrace that comes back to us. We cannot blame Uncle Sam or Israel or the Jews or England or 19th century policy of Great Britain and so forth and so on for it. It's the fault of the Islamic community. But nevertheless, it poses a great challenge. If we're all living in Brazil, it would not matter what Brazil does because there's no power in the Islamic world. But we're not living in Brazil. We happen to be living in a country whose actions and decisions have a very important role to play in the future of the Islamic world itself. And therefore it poses a very special challenge and calls for the channeling, in fact, of the energies of the community here to do things in the future which has not been able to do until now, which is pitiable. It's absolutely pitiable when 60 people are killed in the middle of the third holiest shrine of the Islamic world, with people taking off the shoes and with the socks shooting people with a machine gun, and then what happens? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. That is a very, very important and painful situation, which of course is also a challenge because one just cannot go on and disregard things as if it didn't exist. Finally, the last great challenge, and this is especially true for the Muslim community in the state of California, is that the loss of the traditional religious world in the West, the breakup of what had replaced it, that is the secularist philosophies of the Renaissance and rationalism and so forth of the Age of Enlightenment. And this freedom have together joined hands to make possible the creation of an incredible number of pseudo-religions and pseudo-spiritualities, especially in the state of California, what's sometimes called California religion, which is extremely dangerous, especially for the Islamic community. Until the 1960s, the corruption and dilution of authentic Oriental spirituality was limited to India and Japan, especially the Vedanta and Zen. In the 60s, when I used to come and lecture from Tehran here occasionally in San Francisco, you had all these young people who were Zen, and they didn't know how to sit for 10 minutes on the ground, but they were all considered themselves Zen because they thought they could reach illumination without believing in anything, doing anything, this sort of thing. Then things shifted to Neo-Vedanta and Ram Dass and those people who were here, and then psychedelics, LSD, all kinds of things. And then unfortunately there came the turn of Islam, with Sufism, one of the great spiritual treasury of Islam, which a number of ruthless people began to exploit by first of all divorcing it from the Sharia, from Islam, as if you could grow pistachios without a pistachio tree and without the shell. If you ever find a tree that just gives the nut of pistachio, please let me know. This total absurdity. And you've begun to get very, very dangerous deviations, which most of them die out after a while, but they can also do a great deal to misguide and mislead. Just this last year, like 2 years before it, the poet who sold the most titles of book of poetry in America was Jalaluddin Rumi. It was not Shakespeare, the greatest poet of the English language, nor John Keats, nor Milton, perhaps the next two greatest. It was the great poet of the Persian language, Jalaluddin Rumi. But this whole phenomenon is oftentimes divorced from the tree that made Jalaluddin Rumi. The tree of Islam. Rumi never missed a prayer all of his life. You would never even think of it. If you just looked at him, a person became very pious. He didn't have to speak even. And this idea of distortion of, first of all, the spiritual treasury of Islam, and then people who begin to interpret Islam as if they're great alims without being able to read 3 words of Arabic or Persian. They give their own fatwas, they read the Quran, they say, I'm going back to the Quran myself. There should be 5.5 billion schools of law in Islam, or 1.2 billion correspond to the whole of the Islamic community in the world. This is something, of course, very dangerous and dispersive. It is true that there are differences in Islam that have to be overcome, including difference between Sunnism and Shiism. I mean, it's enough that any time the price of oil is in danger of going up or something like that, there's a Sunni or Shiite riot in Lahore, a few people get killed, and then some people kill each other, and especially in the Persian Gulf, and a few more $1 billion go, you know, from where to where. I mean, this has to come to an end. And there are many young people who are unhappy about this, want to bring back the unity of Islam. But each act needs an actor suitable for that act. Not everyone can play the role of Rostam. You have to be a Rostam to be able to battle Esfandiar, as we say in Persian mythology. And this idea that you have people who have very little knowledge of anything, simply taking Islamic law, the traditions, the hadith, comment upon the Quran into their own hands, and deciphering them and interpreting them, and then calling themselves new groups and so forth and so on. They might have good intention, one prays for them, but that's totally against the unity of Islam. The unity of Islam is not the uniformity of Islam. If God wanted Islam to be uniform, it would have been uniform. The Prophet would not have said that the difference in the view of the scholars of my community is from the mercy of God. The difference of the view of the ulama of my community. So this is a very, very important challenge, that the very freedom and the very breakup of the traditional molds of religious thought, the challenges that are posed to Christianity, of feminism, of homosexuality, of all kinds of different things which are coming to the fore, will pose for the Islamic community. But despite all of these challenges, there's no doubt that to be a Muslim in America today is something much more significant than many people might think, because the 5 or 6 million Muslims in this country are destined, I believe, by Allah Ta'ala to play a very important role, not only in their own lives, that's difficult enough to live as a good Muslim, but also for the rest of the Islamic world. They're bound to play an extremely important role as a pressure group, as a source for guidance, as help, as bridge for the understanding between the West and the Islamic world, for the vast Islamic world, which is in a very critical moment of its history, which is under certain pressures of an economic and political kind, which oftentimes cannot respond the way it should to the great challenges that pose it. And therefore, the question how to live as a Muslim in America is not only significant for those people in this room and similar rooms in this country, but also for over 1 billion people who have accepted the La ilaha illallah Muhammadun Rasulullah, and who try to live and die as people devoted to God and surrender to His will. Thank you. Thank you very much. One or two questions, because time is very late.